You're listening to Three Makes Baby, a podcast about fertility, family, and genetics. I'm Jana Rupnow, a fertility counselor and author of Three Makes Baby. Welcome to the show. Hello there to my 30,000 listeners, well, approaching that number. I'm honored for you to listen to this podcast. I can't believe it's going to be my 41st episode. Many of you know that I'm an advocate for healthy family narratives, and especially when you've built your family in a non-traditional way, if that's through donor conception or surrogacy or through adoption. I believe open and honest family communication, it really leaves little space for shame and secrecy, and those are the things we don't want children to internalize. So one way to change the narrative is to shed light on the source of some of these confusing narratives and the practices in the field that create even further confusion. I just ask that you listen with an open mind as I speak to Gail Pascoe in this episode today. I just love to sit down and have coffee with you. So this is my way of sitting down and having coffee with you. So I'm really excited, Gail. And I know a lot of people follow you and have followed your account, and I'm sure they're very excited to get to hear the lady behind this account and this great wealth of information. So can you tell me about a little bit about your story? I know a little bit from reading about you, but what kind of got you on this path and prompted you to start the Instagram account, Donor Conception and Beyond?
Well, I decided about 5 years ago when I started doing a little bit of research into donor conception, because I discovered that my daughter had a lot of siblings. I'm not sure how many there were at the time, but currently there's well over 100. And that really appalled me. I just thought that was incredibly unethical and not sure how that happened. So I decided that I was going to write a book. So, and initially I started writing a memoir, and then I spoke with Kate Bourne, the Victorian Assisted Reproductive Treatment Authority, or VARTA, and they're quite progressive. So Victoria is one of the states in Australia. They're quite progressive in terms of legislation and just looking after donor conceived people, really. And she said, look, there's quite a few memoirs out there. What we need is a how-to.
Yes.
We need how to show people what the options are out there, how to choose a donor, all the legislation, how to talk to your donor conceived children, that sort of thing. So I started researching that, and 5 years later I'm still writing the book, but I'm intending to finish it this year. So my Instagram page really is just about introducing people to some of these concepts and helping to educate people who are starting on this track about some of the things that I didn't know, that I was ignorant about, and maybe saving people some grief around, in particular, large numbers of siblings, but also a range of other things related to donor conception, which, of course, there's lots of lovely stories out there, but there is some really appalling things happening.
Yes. And, I just looked it up, what you talked about. It looks like the acronym is VARTA, VARTA. It's the Victorian Assisted Reproductive Treatment Authority. It says it's an independent, they provide independent information and support for individuals, couples, and health professionals on fertility and issues related to assisted reproductive treatment, and that they are funded by the Victorian Department of the Health and Human Services. So it looks like it is run by independents. And do you know if they are funded by the government?
They're government funded, and they, I guess every state, actually, there are some states in Australia. There's some Commonwealth legislation, some national legislation, and then there's 2 territories, but 6 states, 2 territories, and only 4 of them have legislation. So we're still there's a way to go in terms of covering off, and improving things related to donor conception. But we also have some ethical guidelines, yes. And ethical guidelines are not legislation, but the fertility clinics over here must comply with the ethical guidelines.
Is there an authority that regulates or that enforces the regulations?
There is the Reproductive Technology Accreditation Committee.
Okay.
They are comprised of, interestingly, some people who are employed by fertility clinics, or, for example, might be CEO of a fertility clinic. So, in my opinion, they're conflict of interest. They do get independent bodies to go and regulate the clinic. To
enforce,
audit.
Okay.
Audit fertility clinics. Essentially,
okay,
they oversee the stuff that goes on at the fertility clinics. There are people in there that are not connected with individual fertility clinics as well.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's an interesting situation.
I think you and I are on the same page where we are both, our goal is to encourage ethical practices in the field. We're both independent. I don't work for any clinics or agencies, and I haven't for the past decade. I work for myself. And while that makes it sometimes hard to be heard, it helps me to keep me in a position that I can do what I feel is the right thing and help families, couples, and individuals be informed to the best of their ability and not be misled. So I think we have an uphill climb, don't we?
We do, because it is a huge money-making industry, and unfortunately, that cash incentive leads the way for a lot of clinics and banks and some individuals as well. So it's hard to. It's challenging.
It's very challenging. I feel like there's enough people out there that want to know what's really happening, and they want to be informed, and they want to do the best thing for their kids, that the people will eventually, kind of start to ask the right questions and dictate who they use based on how these clinics practice and if they practice ethically or not.
Absolutely. I think there's lots of people opening their eyes. I think social media certainly helping with that, and lots of forums where you've got, you can see people on there speaking about their personal experience, and that I can see a shift. Yeah, certainly in the 5 years that I've been researching this book, there are people that are really interested in knowing what impact is this going to have on my child.
Yeah,
I think one of the big problems is the narrative that these clinics and sperm banks and egg banks continue to tell people, which is that it's just a donor and it's just a sperm or it's just an egg. And that might be so for recipient parents, but in many cases that is not so for donor conceived children and adults. It's their biological parent. So I think that's hugely problematic.
Yeah. And did you find that in your experience? Did the clinic tell you that as well when you were going through donation consent? They said that to you. And then when did your daughter, right? When did she start asking questions and really expressing her feelings about it to you?
The first incident was when she was 2. I remember being in the supermarket. She wouldn't have really had a conceptual knowledge of any of this by then, of course, but she was calling out to me and she said, "Mummy, Mummy," and then she said, "Daddy." And I turned around and I went, "Oh, right, I guess we better start this conversation."
Yeah.
I'd already been talking to her about it, and she wouldn't really fully understood us. Just sort of going through the motions, I guess, of practicing as recommended. But when I noticed that she really had some grief, when she could really articulate what was going on for her, it's probably when she was about 6 or 7. And she told me that she was really sad that she didn't have a daddy. And last year, when she was 7, she told me that she would never, ever use a donor.
She told you that last year?
Yeah.
And how old is she now?
She's 8, almost 9.
Oh, she's 8 or 9. Okay. Yeah.
So she has a lot of siblings. She has, over 100. So I think she finds it really difficult to get her head around that.
Oh, I bet. It's so hard there's no social narrative for that. Did you use a clinic in Australia, or I'm sorry, a bank in Australia?
There's no sort of sperm banks, if you like, per se, in Australia. So the way it works here is there's a number of different ways, but one is that you've got a fertility clinic, and if they have contractual agreement with an international sperm bank, the sperm bank will ship the sperm into the clinic, and then you would go through assisted reproductive treatment and fertility of choice. Yeah, so in the clinic that I used, they told me that the state limit was 5 families. So I went along with that, thinking that sounds fairly reasonable. However, what they didn't mention was that there's a worldwide limit, which the sperm bank, I was going to say enforces, but they didn't really enforce it.
Yeah.
No. And when I found that out, they told me that the sperm bank's limit was 20 families, which I was a bit shocked at. Then they upped the ante to 40 and then up to 60. However, they claim now that they do enforce that limit, but when I found out there was over 80 families who've used my sperm donor. And I just thought that was, wow.
It's so irresponsible. Doesn't it make you wonder, wasn't there someone that worked for the bank at some point must have thought, this doesn't feel right? But I think they convince themselves they're helping people and they don't think of the long-term consequences.
Yeah, I often wonder that. I think that's a really good question, because I periodically contact the sperm bank and I ask how many children there are. And I usually do it via email. And I get somebody who's very friendly and very chirpy in their response and love to help you. And then when I start asking the really hard questions, or what they do is they ignore my specific questions. And they'll say, yes, we know there's over 60 families. And I'll respond and say, yes, I know that too. I know, in fact, there's over 80 families. And then the emails start getting a little bit quieter.
Yeah.
So they won't tell me how many children there are. And I think because they don't know.
They don't know, yeah.
They know how many are reported at birth. But, my understanding is that only about, I think it's just over 50% of people in the US actually report a birth. So how many children are there that haven't been reported?
Yeah.
Will we ever know?
Yeah, that's true. We do hear from donors too that say that they thought their sperm, maybe a few families would pick their sperm, and were shocked to also find out that they had that many offspring.
Yeah, it must be a real shock. Although I do wonder sometimes, because I think some of the donors must have been donating for quite a long period of time and quite frequently in order to produce that many children. But I don't think the counselling is necessarily that effective either, or if any.
I've never counseled a sperm donor in the decade of counseling. Not one. Not one has been referred to me. So I don't think counseling is really being done. I think it's being done possibly by the staff, the internal staff, which we know there is a conflict of interest. So, I think that, I know when I did research on it about a year ago and maybe 6 months ago, and it could have changed, but they were administering a test. The one clinic I called, but the test was more of a personality test in the way of, what are you like? Are you bubbly? Are you reserved? Are you quiet? It wasn't a true personality inventory that was looking for any kind of pathology or disorder.
Right.
So, I don't know that they do any screening, at least here, on sperm donors still that's very extensive, because it would be expensive to do.
Well, I know that if in Australia, if you were using an international sperm donor, the sperm bank is supposed to comply with Australian guidelines in that they are meant to undergo counselling to Australian standards. Now, whether that occurs or not, or whether it does comply with Australian standards, I'm not clear.
Do the Australian standards require that the counseling be done by an independent person outside of the bank, or is a staff member in the bank okay to do? Is that okay?
It is okay as long as
Okay.
they have accreditation for fertility. They can use, so you can either use the counsellor supplied by the fertility clinic, or you can go and source your own independent fertility clinic, fertility counsellor, as long as they, excuse me, accredited in fertility counselling. So potentially.
Yeah. So in that way, then they possibly were meeting the guidelines because, like I said, a lot of places have in-house counselors that work for the organization. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Right.
but it is a conflict of interest because if your employer, your boss that's paying you your paycheck every week is motivated by passing individuals so he or she can, make the money and get more donors and have more donors for parents and match more people, then you're going to have a little bit more a lenient look at if a person is ready to donate. You might pass over things that you wouldn't otherwise. I've had egg donation agencies that used me for independent counseling and screening on their egg donors. And when I found a psychological disorder, they called me up furious that I was giving them bad news and that this person had bipolar disorder. And they questioned my testing. They questioned me, and they were furious when I didn't pass their donors.
So, that's frightening, isn't it? Yeah, I've written a few blog posts around cutting corners and things like that. And one of the families in this said that the percentage of children in they had 25 or 30 children in their group who'd used the same donor, and some massive percentage of them had a number of disorders such as ADHD, autism, so well above the average. So, which suggests, of course, that it points back to the donor. So, in that instance, was the donor screened effectively? Were they screened at all? Yeah.
I had a case on my podcast, an episode where a young mom got pregnant with a donor. It was a first-time donor, and her baby had a severe heart defect, and she lost the baby at 20 weeks. And she called the clinic back to tell them that this donor had the baby had a heart defect, and she wanted to let the clinic know, and she also wanted to let the donor know, so the donor would know for her own future children. And they said, no, we're not going to tell her that information. And that's in the podcast episode you can listen to with Liz. I can't remember which number it is, but I think it's number 8.
Well, in my research, I've encountered some interesting things that the sperm banks do, such as, in fact, this happened in our group, I believe, posting a new donor, inverted commas, the new, and then discovering actually that they've already got a couple of dozen children.
Wow. So they're lying.
Yeah. And then you find the donors who have donated at more than one clinic, and apparently there's about a quarter of donors in the US who donate at more than one clinic. So you might decide, you know what, I'm going to really be careful here, and I'm going to purchase sperm from a donor it's a term called exclusive, which means exclusive can vary in its definition. It can mean either one family, excuse me, can use the donor, or it might mean just 5 families worldwide or 10 families worldwide. You think, yeah, I'm doing the right thing here. And then the donor may have donated another clinic or another sperm bank. So, or they may then go out and decide to be a known donor and donate outside of the sperm banks. So you really don't know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
And then the communication can be poor at the sperm banks. As you said, that there are a number of cases of where people have reported illnesses or inherited disease in their child, and they won't share it with the other families unless it's a life and death situation, this kind of thing. So,
wow. Yeah. And we had a case, I know there's a case here where, I don't know if this happens in Australia, where if a sperm bank is going out of business and gets bought out by a larger bank, they will acquire all the frozen sperm from the smaller bank, and not change their marketing platform. So they may be marketing their sperm donors as educated, a certain type of donor. And then when they acquire these other donors, they may be from a different region, in the country, or have they don't even really know the qualifications of these donors because the paperwork was maybe not kept up really well. And they never change their marketing. So then the couple goes to the sperm bank thinking they're getting this really highly screened donor when they might be getting a donor that the company acquired from a smaller bank from a different region, and they not telling them. Does that happen?
Yeah, that can have impacts as well in terms of the guidelines that sperm bank has. So, for example, if the previous smaller sperm bank had a sensible family limit of, say, 10 families, and the bigger sperm bank that purchases them has a one of 20 or 30, then that impacts people who have got existing children from the sperm donors, and they continue to sell the sperm so that, does that make sense? So that previously I've got a child, I believe that the family limit is 10. Now the new sperm bank has purchased a smaller one, and they've decided to up the ante. So now the family limit has increased, and then siblings come out of the woodwork
later. So it changes. So you may go in and be told the limit is 10, but if they get sold out to a bigger bank now, and the bank changes the policy, now it could be 20, 25, 30. And so you're already a parent, you have no choice. And now this is happening to your child's future, is that they have more siblings now. Okay. Wow. I didn't think about that, but there's so many things that people don't know. And there's so many things that aren't being shared on purpose. There's no transparency. And that's what I'm calling for, is transparency.
And the legislation, or lack thereof, means that they can really do anything they want.
Yes. Yeah. There are just the beginnings of some laws coming about here in the United States, but there's recently the law that has been passing in a couple states, including Texas, is that doctors cannot use their own sperm without consent, and they've criminalized it. So if a doctor uses his own sperm to impregnate his patient without telling her, it's a crime.
There's so many victims of that way.
Yeah.
Genetically conceived people have discovered that their mother's sperm donor is in fact a fertility doctor, and it's and multiple children in some cases.
Yeah. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that was, they just never dreamed that anyone would ever find out. Never could see, like, there would be technology that could make it so easy to know the truth.
Yes. Yeah. DNA testing.
Yeah. It changed everything. It really changed everything. And it's a good thing, because I think without DNA testing, it would be really difficult to have any change come about. It would be very difficult. That the DNA testing, I'm hearing more and more just in the past year. My clients are coming to me, telling me now, when they didn't before, that their clinic and their agencies are finally telling them that anonymity doesn't really exist anymore.
Wow. Yeah, and I wonder about that. Like, what are they actually? And I had a conversation on Instagram about a woman from Egg Agency, which you were a part of, and I asked her, what is it that you tell potential donor recipients when you tell them that they are able to select anonymity? How are you guaranteeing that in today's world of DNA testing? And she didn't respond.
She didn't respond. Yeah.
Because really, what they're telling them cannot possibly be true.
That's right. It's not true. It's impossible now. I think they use the term maybe to mean that you don't know the identity at this point, but that's all it can possibly mean, is you don't know now, but that doesn't mean you can't know at some point in the future. Yeah. So there's different terminology, I think, that needs to be applied. And maybe, in the adoption field, it used to call it closed versus open adoption. I think in donor conception, at least over here, they're calling it donor ID release, or there's various terms, but there's no one standard term either. So each client I talk to has almost a different term of what their agency uses, and they have to explain it to me every time. I have to say, okay, tell me what that means for your
Right.
because I don't know, well, they tell me, and I tell you, most of the time the clients are confused. They don't even really know for sure. They're kind of like, well, I think what it is we can have, the child can have this information at 18. Well, what if there's a health problem and you want to contact? I'm not sure. I said, you may not get the answers, but at least you've asked.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. I think same in Australia, the definitions varied up. We tend to use ID release, but, and interestingly, so my daughter also got very angry when she found out that she couldn't get the donor's identifying details until she's 18.
Mm-hmm.
And technically not allowed to contact him until she's 18. She said, but that might be so old. I will have missed 18 years if that were. That's a stupid rule.
Yes.
And I agree with her.
I agree too.
It's really interesting that they've made this rule about 18 and why it's in place. I don't know why they put it in place originally, but now I think it really is convenient for a lot of the sperm and egg banks and things because, it just sort of keeps people separated. And I think that makes it much more convenient for them.
I agree. It's a matter of convenience. And they just don't have to deal with it. And if time passes, maybe they won't have to deal with it ever. But I agree with you. It actually not knowing until 18, the kids miss out on those crucial years where knowing helps them understand who they are.
Yes.
And that information can give them pieces of their identity. I don't know if you know, but I was adopted at 6 weeks old, and it was a closed adoption. And so I didn't know anything about my birth. I knew some details, some height, eye color, some ethnic background, but I didn't meet my birth father until I was 20. And by that time, that was a lot of time to try to fill in a gap with a bunch of imagination. And I have a big imagination. So I a lot of time wondering and creating this idea that probably it wasn't really based in reality, but I didn't know any better. I was a kid. So that's the kind of, it's called the fantasy family or the fantasy parent. And why that's difficult on a kid is that it creates a sense of operating in not in reality at times, and also an unrealistic expectations of that person who's missing. Like maybe there's some ideal person and they are, a famous singer, or, maybe they're just like this, you just fill in the blank with anything that the child's imagination can take them to. And, that's where it becomes difficult then when you're faced with the real person. And what does this mean to me now at 18? And who am I? And, this person actually turned out to be kind of different than I expected. Is that there's can just be this confusion that, and not to say that wouldn't be there anyway at some point, just, we're going through your teenage years are confusing. But I think that to make this arbitrary 18 years old, that's like, it is, it's unusual. I think they picked it because that's the way adoption law worked, is that you could open your records at 18. So I couldn't have access to my own records until I was 18 as well. And then I had to petition a judge to have them open up so I could find out who my birth parents were. And also just parents, when you're a new parent and you're young and you want, or not young, you want to have that experience to yourself. And I think there's a fear that knowing who that other person is might intrude or invade your family life. And I think there's just a lot of fear around that. And I know there is, because parents talk to me about it all the time.
Yes, yeah. I think that's very common. But then on the flip side, when we speak with donor-conceived adults and they say, well, it doesn't make me love my parents any less, parents that raised me. So it's an interesting perspective to hear from the children and the adults.
Yeah. There's enough love. There's space to love more than one person in your life. So there's space to love more than one parent figure in your life too. And, it doesn't have to be, I know you mentioned that a lot of donor or conceived adults and kids believe that they see that as a biological parent, not a donor. We use the word donor a lot of times to dissociate from the importance of that person. And to some people, it may just be a donor. It may just be a donor. To other people, it may not be. It may be very much more, a biological kin. And so, how do you know how your child's going to respond?
Yes, it's huge. It's refreshing, really, isn't it? I think we need to prepare for that possibility.
With adoption research, what I found is that they say that it really depends on the personality of the child as to how they react to being adopted or feelings of adoption. And you can look at it and break it down into almost thirds. So 1/3 of the population of adoptees, or 1/3 of adoptees, really are curious about their biological parent and want to know more from a very early age. The other third, they aren't curious at all. They don't really ask about it. It's not really relevant to them. And then that final grouping of the third, they aren't curious until a life event comes along that triggers their curiosity. And so you're really looking kind of at 2/3 of adoptees that are curious at some point. And then this researcher, David Brodzinski, wrote a book called Being Adopted, The Lifelong Search for Self. He says that 100% of adopted individuals search are their biological parents in their mind. Because the search isn't just about a physical search. It's about thinking about that person that helped you come to be and wondering. And I find that fascinating. So I wonder if those same numbers might apply to donor conceived, maybe a little less so, just given that they do have one parent they are genetically related to. So maybe there's less curiosity, but it'd be so interesting to know. I'm really looking forward to studies on that someday.
Yes. Yeah. I always think, I wonder what donor conception is going to look like in 20 years' time. Will it be similar to, adoptees who've really made inroads to that and improved? And I really hope so.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
We have a good model, and I've talked about before in the adoption community. So it's been done, and there's ways to do it. We can learn from the adoption community as to how to navigate relationships between biological and social parents and make that work. So the child has access to all of that information from the time that they're little, and they can use it or not as much as they want. Maybe they don't really want to know their biological parent or donor much, but they are, but they have that choice at least. It's not kept from them.
Yes, and I think that's a really important bit, is about having that choice, isn't it? And some of them are going to say, all right, I've met my donor, I'm not really that interested, and that's okay, but at least they've had that choice put forward to them.
The other thing I was going to say is, and I wonder if your daughter fits into this category. I mentioned it in my book. I think that it could be just, again, the personality of your child. And some children are deeper thinkers, and they are curious, and they are, they might be the personality types that do really want to know. And it's a trait that Dr. Elaine Aron over here researched called the highly sensitive person. And it's found it's a normal personality trait found on the alleles of DNA. What do you think?
Yeah, I've done some research on highly sensitive people as well, the 20-odd% of the population, because I'm quite sensitive. I'm not highly sensitive after I read all the criteria, but my daughter is not highly sensitive either, but she is sensitive. So I feel for her, and she definitely is curious, and she definitely wants to know, and she would like to meet him if she could. I know that. And she feels grief around his absence. But she's happy generally. She's a happy little person. But it sort of comes in cycles, I think. And if she's triggered by something, or if somebody asks her a question, or I guess how she's feeling on the day, she might express some sort of grief, anger. There's some anger there as well. So we have conversations about it. I let her initiate. We have conversations about it when she needs to, and I've just told her that I've said to her that I'm sorry, not not in the sense that I'm sorry that she exists, because I think that's a dangerous road to go down, but I'm sorry that it's not a known donor and
Yeah.
that it's
Okay.
available to you. And in hindsight, that's probably the path I would have gone down. But,
Okay.
hindsight's a beautiful thing, so we just have to move on with the situation that we've got. And I know that personally, if I was in her situation, I would be feeling the same things. I would be feeling grief. Some trauma later on, I think, as well.
No, I was just reflecting on what you were saying, because one, I really think people should understand that when we say sensitive, it's not in the way of people go, oh, your feelings are easily hurt or you're soft. So this is a name for a trait for people that are deep thinkers, that are highly perceptive. They have a depth of processing. They notice subtleties in their environment. They tend to be very empathetic. And because of all that stimulation, they pick up on extra things in their environment. And so they tend to be more easily overstimulated. There's so many gifts to it, but then that one, that being wanting to know more is truly, truly a part of who they are. And to minimize that or dismiss that for them it could be quite devastating to them, because it almost denies who they are.
Yeah, and I think just going back to that narrative that we are fed all the time by the clinics and the sperm banks and the egg banks, that this person is just a donor, just a sperm egg. And that is so heavily ensconced in people's minds. When I have conversations, I'm like, what are you talking about? It's just a donor. And for me, it did take quite a while to get my head around that as well, on these multiple Facebook and Instagram groups and things, when hearing from donor conceived people. And it took a little while for the penny to drop. And I think one of the statements that somebody made which helped, was when they said, when you have adoptees and you have people who are conceived by a one-night stand, why is it that they're allowed to go and find their biological parent? And in many cases, they're actively encouraged to go and find their biological parent. And donor conceived people are not. And I thought, wow, yeah, that's because it's not spun that way by the clinics. It's really brainwashed, and it takes a while to undo that brainwashing. So it really saddens me when, I understand that people are not getting it because of that, but it does sadden me, and I wonder for their child how that's going to play out, completely separated from siblings as well.
But yeah, I do think that it is hard for people to understand why it is more than a sperm and more than just an egg or just a sperm to the person that is created as a result of that.
And it's funny because I think a lot of donor conceived adults say, well, he or she, they're not my donor. They didn't donate anything to me. And they can be quite, a bit angry over people using that term.
I've heard that.
My daughter used that when she met up with a couple of her siblings who we meet up with frequently, and they had an argument about it because the other parent had not been using that term with them, and she became quite confused. Her daughter became quite confused when my daughter was saying, well, he's not my donor, he's my biological parent. And the other child was saying, he's not my parent, he's just a donor. So that was really interesting. Yeah.
It's so many, there's so many different perspectives, and we have to respect all of them, because that is a reality. It's a reality for your daughter that is her biological parent. And then it's a reality for the other that it's not. I think that's what's so difficult, is there is no one right way. I do believe there are right ways ethically in the business, in the field. That's a whole different topic. But in terms of how the kid feels about it, that grows into the adult, there are so many different feelings, and we just have to respect where they're coming from. And guess what? And I know you know this, they might start out being, oh, it's just a donor. And then when they're 35, they can change their mind. They can feel differently over time.
That's so true. And I think it's one of the triggering things for donor conceived people, isn't it? And some of the stories I hear as well is that because you've got recipient parents on these groups, and if I've spoken with saying, my kids, they're not showing any interest. They don't want to meet the donor, or they don't want to know anything about the donor. And then you've got this donor conceived adult saying, well, that was me. I used to say that because I wanted to protect my parents.
Yeah.
I didn't want to upset my parents by saying, actually, I would really like to know a bit more about them or meet them, or whatever that plays out. But so I'm really mindful of that as well.
Yeah.
I'll just allow her to say anything she wants.
That's right. The both adoptees and donor conceived individuals do take on a protective role of their parents. And at times, in order to not bring up sensitive or painful information, if the parents haven't dealt with those feelings and that loss, then it becomes this taboo topic. Like almost an implied message, you're supposed to be okay with this. So if you're not, then I'm not okay. Then mom and dad aren't okay. So we really hope you're okay, right? You're okay, aren't you? Well, what's the kid going to do? Of course this kid's going, yeah, I'm good, because they just depend on you. So so that we have to be so careful of. Yeah. And they do protect it. Their parents don't feel like comfortable sharing because they care about them. They don't want to hurt their feelings. And I think talking about the hard stuff makes you even closer. People are so afraid that if they talk about it, it's going to interfere with their family. But in our experience, by talking about it, it's made our bond stronger.
If you feel angry, that's okay. I'll hear you. You can be angry about this. You can say anything you want to me, and I'll listen to you. And so we'll see how that unfolds.
Yeah, because she's 8, right? Yeah. My daughter's 15, and yeah, she told the first time she told me I wasn't her real mom was when she was about, I think she was like 4 or 5. I thought it was going to be teenage years, and she was so young when she screamed it at me. I have a visual memory of where we were standing. That's how much because I was prepared for it, but not that soon. Being a therapist, I'd considered it, and so it happened pretty early on.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I guess I don't have that issue, but I suppose people who've used egg donors and
they do.
Of course, men who've used a sperm donor.
Yeah. They do.
Potentially going to be receiving end of that kind of comment.
Yeah.
I've had the normal, you're the worst mum in the world kind of comment.
The worst mum, yeah, or I hate you. I've had that one too.
I wish Nana was my mum.
Oh. Oh no. Don't tell Nana that. No. So yeah. For my daughter, she has moments of anger and sadness. And if she brings it up, we just stop everything and we just talk about it, especially in middle school. And that helped. And sometimes she just didn't really know what she was feeling. She's like, I'm sad, but I don't know why. So I had to try to connect some dots, if it was like a family tree project at school and she was crying that night trying to work on it. And I'd be like, is this upsetting you? No, I'm just mad about, my water spilled. And it's like, well, okay, let's talk about this. And if I asked a few more questions, out came the real feelings, which was, yes, I do think about it. Yes, I wonder what happened. Yeah, I wonder if she died. My friend asked me a couple weeks ago if my birth mom died, and that's the first I'd heard of it. So I was like, she did? Okay, well, tell me, let's talk, and yeah, sometimes they just don't come out right away. So you kind of have to ask these little questions and get it out of them.
Yeah, and I'm going to include in the book as well lots of stories. So from donor conceived people, from donor recipients and donors. So just to sort of, provide some lived experience from all of the different perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. There are so many different perspectives. I've appreciated your honesty on your Instagram post, the way you present questions and the controversy surrounding donor conception in a way that I think makes people think. Have you ever had negative responses to your account at all?
Yes. Yeah. And so sometimes when I post something quite controversial, that opposes somebody's current line of thinking, I'll lose followers. And that doesn't really bother me per se. What upsets me is that they've now lost the chance, I guess, of listening to other people's comments and sort of opening themselves to something that perhaps they hadn't previously considered. So I do get people that, and I have had some people responding to things like, I think I asked a question once about should donor names be placed on birth certificates, and I actually believe they should. I think that there should be a line, donor to, if you get double donation or embryo, that they should be on there for your child, because I think everything should be child-centric about this whole donor conception process. We really should be focused on the child. So in that way, they know exactly who their biological parents are. They know who the parents are that are raising them, and they don't have to do any searching. And I've had people respond on a particular post, you know, they're just a donor. Why would they want to be? Why should they be on the birth certificate? It's ridiculous type comments. Yet, interestingly, people often then talk about how they want to, they have difficulty using a donor. Because they're not using their own genetics, and the child is not going to be genetically related. Yet they then struggle with the fact that their child might want to know their biological parents and their genetics. So it's sort of an invisible hypocrisy, and a lack of awareness around the hypocrisy. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's or a form of denial, or that I've seen that as well, and there's so many varying perspectives under that too. So when I remember I first started counseling, I thought that same thing, because people would come to me and go, I absolutely do not want to adopt, but we want to use a donor. And okay, but tell me about, why what your thoughts are on adoption. Well, I just can't imagine, raising a child that's genetically different, and it just, just not open to it. Or maybe they wouldn't know why. They would say, I just don't know, but it's just not for me. And then we would get into the details of, well, your child might feel the same about as an adopted child in ways and at times. And so there was this denial in place where it was like, well, we can, but so there's one of two things. So it's either kind of depending on their reactions, it was either, well, we can deny this though, and it doesn't matter what the child feels, kind of like, this is how I feel, and I'm going to kind of just move on. Or there was a sense of, but we want more control, and this feels more familiar. And so like in the case of a male that would use a sperm donor but wouldn't adopt, that he would say, well, I know it's coming from her though, from my wife, and it's part of, and then there was a third scenario where it'd be like, I understand that, but we would adopt, but we really want to have a child together. My wife wants to experience pregnancy, and I really want to see my wife in our baby. And so there was a sense of, in some couples that say, we just want to see the love that we share, a product of that love. And that, so, you kind of have to suss out what it is. Is this a deep denial, a rejection of genetic differences? Or is this a real true desire to experience pregnancy and some sort of normal, route to parenthood, and to see your spouse in your offspring, even if it's not you? But at the same time, you can embrace the genetic differences and be that parent that, that says, hey, I know we're different and I accept it. So I see things across the entire spectrum with parents.
Yeah. And look, maybe hypocrisy is too strong a word, because I think, again, people have been hearing this line from the clinics and things as well, that it's just a donor, but then forgetting that your child may experience the same feelings around wanting to have that genetic connection.
Yeah, it's complicated. So we've talked about sperm donation. How does egg donation work in Australia?
There's a number of different ways people can do it with their egg donation. Some people will become clinic recruited donors. So in other words, they might have done IVF themselves and have leftover eggs, and they'll decide to donate those. But it's pretty rare. Or they might just come in with the sole intent of donating their eggs and do a cycle that way. But that's really rare, and most clinics suggest, look, don't wait. It might be several years on the waiting list for those. What most people do is they use a known donor. So there are sort of matching websites where donors and intended parents go on, and they'll sort of advertise and say, look, I want a donor. This is my situation. And then the egg donor will approach a person whom they might like to donate to. Then they'll go to a clinic and go through a standard assisted reproductive treatment to do an egg stimulation and transfer, and so forth. The other options are that people will use. There is an agency in Australia that sends people overseas, so they'll do the initial treatment and so forth in Australia. Go over. They'll choose their donor online, go over and do the transfer, and then come back and continue to monitor the pregnancy here.
So is that because is anonymous donation not legal?
Well, so in Australia, anonymous donation is illegal. However, they sort of get around that by sending them overseas. So and nobody is really holding them to that. The other thing that people do is they will use an international egg agency, and they'll go to their ob-gynae or their GP and do the initial cycle here, treatment here. Then they'll choose their donor online and go and do the transfer and things overseas and come back, similar to the Australian agency. But in many cases, almost all, they're anonymous as well.
So they're getting around it.
Yeah. The other thing you can do is you can donate imported eggs and go through a fertility clinic. If you do that, they have to be aligned with Australian, because the eggs are imported into an Australian fertility clinic. They have to align with Australian standards, which is the donor has to be ID release, the donor has to be counselled, on all of these things. So that's in many ways a better way to do it.
Okay.
Going to these countries overseas where anonymity is the only option, like Greece and South Africa.
Okay, yeah, because I definitely read that about Australia, and so it's good to know that, have that information about the policy, and also about how people are finding a way around that too. I know that this show will prompt questions from people, and just to be able to have such a frank conversation with somebody is so important and helpful, and that we're sharing information and putting this. That's how we can continue to make a difference. And I feel very passionately about it. And, when I was first driven to do this work, it was about the kids that were being born. No one was being their voice, or very few people were speaking for them. And they couldn't speak for themselves. And so I really kept them in mind the whole time. And they've always been on the top of my mind, is how can we educate parents to help them, to help their children in the long run and be their guide and example. So, let's keep talking. And I'll wrap it up just by saying, again, thank you so much for coming today. I've been so looking forward to talking to you. So.
Likewise. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Yeah, it's really wonderful. I think you're doing an amazing job as well out there.
Thank you.
Things that you're doing on Instagram and podcasts, and just educating people, because they need to hear another perspective, intended parents and recipient parents, because there are other perspectives than what these fertility clinics and sperm and egg banks are giving us.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thanks for listening. If you would like to follow for more content, you can go to my Instagram and Facebook account at Jana Repnow LPC, or follow 3 Makes Baby on Instagram. You can get a copy of my book and the companion workbook to 3 Makes Baby on Amazon. If you like this podcast, be sure to like and subscribe. Have a great day.